Hi, and welcome back to the panel room. So tonight we're going to be diving in and talking about the Eternals. I'm not sure why, but we're going to do it anyway. So before we dive into it, I'm going to be your host this evening, Jim Nettles. And so let's go around and see who has jumped in with us to have a chat about what may not be the MCU's best film and why. So Keith.
Hi, I'm Keith R.A. DeCandido. I have written a lot of books. Some of them are actually books based on Marvel superheroes, including actually my first professional short story and my first professional novel were both featured Spider-Man. I have since gone on to write in more than 30 different licensed universes, as well as several universes of my own creation. Relevant to this particular panel, I also write about pop culture for Tor.com. And one of the many things I've written for them is a feature called 4-Color to 35mm, the Great Superhero Movie Rewatch, in which I have discussed every single live action film based on a superhero comic book, of which there are, a few. It's a feature that currently I revisit every 6 months or so to catch up with all the new films that have been released. So,
Gail? Hi, I'm a urban fantasy alternate history writer and professional nerd. My claim to fame for Marvel movies is that I have only ever seen the movies. I have not read any of the comics. And I'm actually really cranky right now because due to that thing that is happening in the world right now, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness is the only Marvel movie since the first Iron Man that I did not see in theaters opening weekend.
Nancy?
I'm Nancy Northcott. I write historical fantasy for Falstaff Books. I collaborate with Jeannie Adams on the Outcast Station science fiction mystery series, and I write several subgenres of romance. I fell in love with comic books when I was 8 years old, which has been a while now. I tried to read the Eternals comic book and could not. And I'm the comics track director for ConTinual, but this is not a comics track panel because I couldn't read the comic book. So Jim is handling it for the panel room.
So obviously tonight there might be some spoilers if you've not seen the film and you so wish to do so. I don't want to rag on it because of anybody, because there are plenty of people that love the film, have found value in the film. And I think that there's a lot to the story, but it's definitely not the best piece from Marvel. But I think that we're now seeing them have a storyline coming in both to fill a lot of the holes of things that have come before, as well as they're using this to kind of come in and set up the new universe, maybe. And I think that's kind of the question, because I think universally there was a lot of people coming and saying this is not what I expected, though I've seen a lot of good things about it as well. There were parts about the film that I definitely enjoyed. There was good parts of the storytelling. There was things that tied it together. But again, in my opinion, for what it's worth, it was not the best of Marvel films. I kind of look at this as DC came in and tried to make a Marvel film, or Marvel came in and tried to make a DC film, or something like that. They just decided to mess up the style. So now that y'all know what I think about it, I want to kind of go around. Let's talk about how you guys felt about the film overall, the story, the storytelling, and maybe even how it fits a little bit to the MCU. So Keith, since you had to watch this thing repeatedly.
I've seen it 3 times now. The biggest problem I think coming into it is that the Eternals never entirely worked as a comic book concept and were never particularly popular. Now that in and of itself, it doesn't necessarily mean it would be a bad movie. And we have Guardians of the Galaxy as another example of something that was pretty much a middling comic book that got turned into a couple of fantastic movies. So it wasn't impossible, but by the same token, the Eternals were created by Jack Kirby, who co-created a lot of Marvel's heroes with Stan Lee in the 1960s. Kirby also co-created Captain America in the 1940s, pretty much with his then collaborator Joe Simon, created the entire genre of romance comics, and has created a lot of characters and a lot of wonderful things, including the New Gods and Apocalypse over at DC. And yet with that pedigree, the Eternals is not his best work. It was canceled mid storyline and wound up having to be finished in the pages of Thor comics a few years later by different writers. Several people have taken a shot at writing the Eternals. Neil Gaiman wrote the Eternals, and There's a reason why people don't generally mention that when they mention Neil's comics resume. It's never a book that has particularly captured anybody's imagination well. And on top of that, what we got was a movie that was about 8 hours worth of story stuffed into a 2.5 to 3 hour very beautifully filmed package. And it didn't entirely work, and at least part of that was because of the source material, and part of it was there's just too damn much stuff going on.
JL, what do you think?
So I saw the movie opening night, and then I watched in theaters, obviously, and then I watched it last night and scrolled Twitter the entire time because that's how interested I was in it. And it, which really bummed me out, because so coming with no Eternals knowledge coming into this movie, all I knew from the hype for it was things that I should have absolutely enjoyed, which is Immortals, found family, like, just all sorts of crazy stuff going on. And then sitting in the theater after the credits, I looked at my friends and I went, well, that was really pretty. and I wanted, like, there are things to love about it in terms of representation, and it's just, but exactly what Keith said, this would have been a great Marvel miniseries, and it did not work as a movie.
Nancy?
I agree with them. It should have been a miniseries. I think the look of it, as JL said, is gorgeous. It's visually very lush. It's beautifully filmed. Conceptually, it's very creative and different. I wanted to really love this movie. And I watched it for the first time yesterday, and I couldn't scroll Twitter because I couldn't follow the non-linear storytelling if I didn't at least maintain some focus on the screen, because we jump back and forth in time for flashbacks that really don't seem to contribute to the forward motion of the story. And then we were an hour into this 2.5 hour movie before the story problem presented itself. And this is a spoiler, which is, this is not the only lifetime the Eternals have had. They have been through eons of being on a planet while a new Eternal is born, which destroys the planet and kills them, and their memories go into storage on some place called the World Forge with this big 6-eyed or 6-dot-faced Arisham, something like that. And then they do the cycle all over again. And they find that out an hour in, and Earth is about to be destroyed because a new Celestial, which is what they're called, not Eternals among themselves, is going to be born. And then we get actual within the group conflict, and some people trying to stop this and some not wanting to stop this and some conflicted about it. And I was thinking, why didn't you tell us this within the first 20 minutes after you established the world and let this propel the story? And stop telling us everything that happened 1,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago in these people's past that doesn't matter right now. And so it was a very frustrating experience because I really came to this movie wanting to love it. And Marvel reissued The Eternals, maybe it was last year, with the recent unpleasantness, all the time it's kind of blurred together for me. And I read about the first 4 or 5 issues, and it was beautifully done in terms of the artwork. But I ultimately gave it up, as I was telling my fellow panelists before we started, for the smallest of reasons, which is the royal blue on black lettering of the captions or narrative boxes or whatever the current term for them is. I literally physically couldn't read it. There's something about it that just didn't work for my eyes. And reading a comic book is not supposed to be work. So I gave up on the comic book. And then I thought, well, movies, like I think it was Keith who was saying, it doesn't have to be a great comic book for a great movie to be made off of it. But it wasn't a great movie.
I think they spent so much time in that first hour because they really, really wanted to set up that connection between Icarus and Cersei. And like, it didn't help that the actors had like no chemistry to begin with. And ultimately, I don't feel like it mattered because they were enough of a family that the division for the final conflict would have been just as impactful if they hadn't spent that whole first hour setting up the worst romance in the MCU, canon.
That was one of the biggest problems with the movie, is that had so many characters in it, and so many of them were badly served. And unfortunately, one of the few characters who actually wasn't badly served and who had a decent arc was Icarus, who was played with an incredibly dreadful "Don't Hate Me Because I'm Beautiful" performance by Richard Madden, who was just horrible and had absolutely no chemistry, as you said, JL, no chemistry at all with Gemma Chan. Gemma Chan also was wasted because she wasn't allowed to have a character because she was too busy moving the plot along. The only characters who really stood out, were able to stand out because they had enough screen time and B, had enough talent, were Kumail Nanjiani, who was hilarious, and as Kingo, yeah.
As you can tell how memorable they were.
And no, I just blanked on. I just blanked on the name. And the other was Angelina Jolie as Thena. They were the only ones. Everybody else either didn't have enough screen time to make an impression. In particular, Makari and Druig could have been removed from the movie and nobody would have noticed, which was, not at all fair to Barry Keoghan and especially to Lauren Ridloff, who deserved way better than this. And it was just, and you could tell characters were being written out or killed off, not so much because the plot needed it, but because there weren't enough lines to go around to everybody and they had to move them off stage or Kingo basically decides he's not going to fight. And it felt like that wasn't a character decision. That was there's too many people in this movie decision. Let's get rid of this guy and let's kill Gilgamesh so we don't have to give Don Lee lines and so on. It was just frustrating as hell.
Well, what
the friendship between Thena and Gilgamesh was way more compelling than whatever was going on between Icarus and Circe.
Yes.
What you said about there being so many characters, I love found families. I've loved the Legion of Superheroes since I was 8 years old, and they are a huge found family. And it never bothered me that there were like a zillion of them until they decided, oh, this is too many kids who can keep up with 750 Pokemon and their status of metamorphosis. They can't keep up with that, so we're going to cut it. Never mind, that's a whole thing. Anyway, they did not build on the found family to the extent that they could have because they're all off in pockets in different places. And it was really only a few points in the movie, and especially there at the end where we saw that they really do care about each other. They don't just fight together. They really are a found family. And I would have liked to see more of that. And honestly, I backed up scenes to listen to them again. I ended up having to go to IMDb to see what the names of all the characters were because they said them so quickly. I couldn't catch them. And they were the only ones I got when Makari's signing was captioned, because then the name was spelled out and I'm like, oh, that's what that word is. And it was just, I think you're right. I think there's too many characters. I didn't understand why Icarus decided he needed to go commit suicide.
Oh, that was white man tears. That's what that was.
And then the deviant that absorbed Gilgamesh comes in at the end, and I thought, what are you doing here? What is your goal? Why are you? What? It just, I don't know.
Okay, thank you. You just thank you, Nancy, because you reminded me of my biggest problem with the movie, more than any other problem. And this is something that you don't appreciate if you haven't read the comics, but makes the movie even worse. In the comics, the deviants are not just monsters. They're actually intelligent. They are sentient. They are clever. They are dangerous because of that. In the comics, there was a whole thing between Thena and Crow, who was one of the deviants, and that was one of the plot lines, was that there was this sort of, Romeo and Juliet thing between the two of them, from the two warring. The deviants and the way Jack Kirby originally set it up, the idea was that the Celestials experimented on several different planets and created, regular humans, Eternals, and Deviants, and the Deviants were not just monsters; they were actually worthy foes. And one of my biggest frustrations with this movie is that the Deviants are just yet another bunch of CGI monsters. Of which,
pretty ones though, very pretty ones.
Yes, no, they looked great, but I was so disappointed in that. While I think the MCU's reputation for feeble villains is overstated, there are some feeble villains in there, and this definitely just fits the bill of just a major disappointment from the source material.
So like I said, not having any info about the source material, like from my perspective, this one deviant becoming like sentient, I was like, A, where did that come from? And B, now I feel really like cheated that like what it was supposed to be wasn't actually in the movie.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it goes back to that idea of they tried to, this could have either been a really good hour-and-a-half movie, this could have been a really good mini series. Because if you've got characters that have been there for thousands of years, and obviously from the names, these are characters that have influenced cultural history. You look at Gilgamesh and Athena, and you pull all these characters in where you're going, oh, okay, well, this is somebody who has definitively shaped human history. And obviously they were a family thrown together at some point. You have the fractures that happens when people spend enough time together. People break off and do what they do. And then eventually this is the found family having to come back together for a unified goal. Or at least that's the story that they wanted to tell, I think. And the flashbacks often weren't the things I think that would have been meaningful to help set up that backstory for these characters to say, this is the reason that the relationship between Gilgamesh and Athena is so important. But again, it was the best relationship we got out of the film. And the most hyped thing was, hey, this is the first Marvel movie that has adult content.
You know what it reminded me of? And I realized this when I watched it the second time. It reminded me a lot of the Watchmen movie and had many of the same problems. Structurally, it was the same plot. It was basically a murder mystery about, one particular character who turned out to be betrayed by one of the theoretical heroes. And with multiple flashbacks. And the Watchmen movie had the exact same problem in that there was way too much story to stuff into a 2.5 hour movie. Watchmen would have been much better served to be adapted as a 12-part miniseries that more closely hewed to the structure of the comic book. And the same thing here. And it was especially frustrating. And for that matter, just like in the Watchmen movie, the guy who played the person who betrayed everybody was not the best actor in the movie by any stretch. And it didn't work for a lot of the same reasons.
So is there anything in the film when you watched it that really did work for you? I mean, again, I think we've all talked about that big piece of the relationship between Gilgamesh and Athena. You see pieces of relationships and you see some people, like Selma Hayek, even though she's not on the scene that much, you can buy the fact that she was that leader of the family. But you can also buy in that elder and that wisdom and all the rest of it. But they didn't quite set that up quite enough before they killed her off, before you're like, aw. Spoiler alert, she died. She's the one who died.
That's the driving force of the plot.
The driving force behind the entire plot. But what were some of the things out of it that you think did work for you?
So at the beginning of the movie, again, no background knowledge of what was going on. In the first deviant attack in London, where Icarus comes in to save the day, I was like, oh God, it's going to be a movie about like Icarus coming in to save the day, and there's going to be a stupid love triangle with Jon Snow. And then by the end of the movie, the fact that the real hero all along was a woman of color, like that was pretty amazing to me.
Nancy, Keith?
I liked the use of the different historical periods. I don't think they were used well, but I like the fact that they were incorporated to show these different cultures that these people had influenced and had been influenced by. And I also liked the diversity of the cast. And like JL was saying, it is very, very rare that the woman saves the day unless the movie is called Captain Marvel or Wonder Woman, because that just doesn't happen. And I mean, just don't even get me started on Hawkeye and Natasha at the whatever the name of that horrible place is. So I really liked that. I really did think the costumes were beautiful, and the magical effects when they were kind of all linking up with the light. The use of light forged weapons was great, I thought. I think part of the problem I had with the movie is when it was over, I saw all these elements that we've talked about, the found family and the magic and the cultural history and the aspects of the family coming together. If the movie had focused more on those, I think it would have been a much better movie.
Coming together and splitting apart, because it's like such a throwaway line that Kingo left Sprite because he was tired of moving so often. And like that could have been so much more interesting. And that would have been like a much more interesting division than Sprite going off with Icarus and Kingo being, well, there's no more room for me. I guess I gotta leave and not resolve any of this.
First of all, like I said before, it's a beautiful film visually, and I really would wish Chloe Zhao had been had gone after any Marvel character. I would love to see what she would do with like a Fantastic Four movie, or I mean, imagine her with sending the Fantastic Four to the negative zone and what she would do with that. It is an absolutely beautiful piece of visual filmmaking, and I especially like, and this is something that's true of all of her films, she manages a wonderful balance between grand spectacle, but without losing sight of the fact that this movie is about people. These characters are still people. They're very recognizably people, for all that they're immortal and super powerful. And I appreciated that balance that she maintained. This was still it looked like a grand epic, but it was still about, not just archetypes, but actual, people. I also like, and I find it interesting actually, that the most interesting and compelling characters in this movie about the Eternals are 3 humans. Four humans. There's Kit Harington's Dane Whitman, who's absolutely wonderful, and he makes the first half hour of the film, and then he's gone until a couple of brief little bits elsewhere in the film. But he was fantastic. Ben and Jack, Phastus's husband and child, were both fantastic. I loved that family, and I think honestly, I would argue that couple was at least as strong a couple as Gilgamesh and Thena. I thought that was a very convincing one of the most absolutely wonderful romantic couples we've seen in the MCU. And my absolute favorite character in the whole damn movie, Harish Patel's Karun. Karun was great. I adored Karun. Karun needed to be in the whole movie, and I was pissed that Kingo went off to not be in the main fight, not because we were losing Kingo, but because we were losing Karun too. Karun's commentary on the movie was just fantastic, and we really need to have a movie that just has like do something where they get like Kat Dennings' character from the Thor movies and from WandaVision together with what's his name from Ant-Man, Luis.
Oh yeah,
Yes.
From Ant-Man and Haroon to just get together and comment on the MCU.
That'd make a great episode. I just want to moderate that one.
I want them to lock the 3 actors in a recording booth and say, be your characters, and do Mystery Science Theater of every single MCU movie.
Yes, that would work.
I think one of the things that was one of my biggest challenges was really framed up by Pixie, because it was, you have these 5,000-year-old figures that are in many cases, again, named, they've had these great influences on history, and seemingly enough, the most mature people we see on film are the humans with very short lifespans. It's this thing of, even over 5,000 years, you've not become an adult. You're a petulant child in the body of a god, and not even a good one at that. And when you see Pixie, that notion of I've been pining for somebody for 5,000 years, and that's enough to betray everyone over at the end of the day, because again, that character is coming across as being, in essence, the disregarded one through, it's the unseen voice that's been ignored. It's in essence, that child figure through the whole film who's in certain ways coming in and calling out and being that harbinger that says, this is how shit can go wrong so very quickly. And that to me was one of the biggest challenges I had, was you didn't see these people as they broke up and separated. Again, going back to the family, with the kid. I mean, he's sitting there, and this idea of the brilliant tinkerer, the brilliant mind who is tortured by the fact that, having helped create the bomb, having brought all these mechanisms. Again, he was almost the only adult in the room and had that mature thought and that mature voice that none of the rest of them had. If all the rest of them had been, I've been around 5,000 years, I guess I got to be an adult in the room. Let's have a conversation. Okay, so this thing's going to blow up the earth, right? Yeah, we've done this before, right? Yep. Do we really care? This is what we're here for. This is our job. Let's have our moral dilemma. Let's have our ethical dilemma, and let's just go do what we're going to go do. But then again, if the adults were in the room, we wouldn't have Marvel.
The thing is, and you actually hit on my biggest issue with the film. The Eternals aren't heroes, which makes them the first MCU protagonists who aren't. Some of them eventually do stumble their way to heroism over the course of the movie. But every other protagonist in an MCU film has been somebody who has been a hero, sometimes against their better judgment, or with their ego getting in the way, as it does with, say, Tony Stark, or with their, youth and youthful enthusiasm getting in the way, as it does with Peter Parker, or their just inanity getting in the way, as it does with Peter Quill. But all of them ultimately are heroes. They are people who, when somebody is in trouble, when the world is in danger, when something bad needs to be stopped, they ante up and kick in. The Eternals aren't that. And I think that was part of what was hard for audiences to get their arms around, was because they aren't heroes. They're victims, really. Or just out and out bad guys. And a couple of the ones who actually have heroic impulses wind up getting killed off for their trouble, including Ajax. And I think that made it harder to, in the comics, the Eternals are unquestionably heroes. They're here to defend the planet. That's their purpose. The whole idea of them being the caretakers of gestating Celestials was created for the movie. And I think it was a bad change. It could have been an interesting change, and if the movie had more breathing space, if it was a 6-hour miniseries on Disney Plus, it might have landed a bit better. But
it would have given a little more context to the fact that, like, why this lifetime? Why Earth? Why are they going against their programming now?
Yeah.
Because
to some extent we got that, because Ajax said that, in fact, and that was one of the ties to the greater MCU. It was the fact that humanity were the ones who restored all the people who were wiped out by Thanos, and that's what led them to finally question which I liked. I did like that connection. I thought that was a good, clever way of tying it into the greater tapestry of the MCU.
It didn't come across that way to me. It came across to me like, because they had to wait, because Thanos offed half of the world, and then they had to wait another 5 years for all those people to come back, that they had more time, although 5 years in their lifespan is an eye blink, to spend there and to develop and to have feelings about it. But see, it wasn't as clear to me as it was to you, Keith. I was sitting there going, okay, why? I was kind of like JL. It's like, okay, why? What are we doing?
Okay, Ajax came out and said it. That was when.
Well, that was part of me not being fully engaged with the movie, possibly. But
fair. It was only in one scene, and it's easy to, yeah.
But also, there was a part where one of them says, he says, we thought we were the heroes and really we're the villains. And if they had explored that, that could have been a really interesting character development. It's like, okay, we've checked that box and now we're rolling on to the next thing. And if they had gotten to the story problem sooner, we would have had more time to develop that, which in turn would have fleshed out all the characters. And if we'd possibly spent a little less time getting the band back together and gotten them together sooner so they could explore these issues, that I think would have.
I think this kind of goes back to one of your points, Keith. To me, it almost felt not so much about a hero's story, which is what we want from these stories. We want a hero's journey. We want the anti-hero's journey. We want that. It felt more like I was watching a bad version of Knives Out, where we weren't sure who the bad guy was, but it was a murder mystery where everybody's just a little bit of a... I mean, and that's really more of what it felt like to me a lot of the time, except a lot more tedious, but pretty.
I think it gets an award for tediousness. I really do. Keith has
They give awards for that?
Conversation beforehand that it's not the most tedious movie ever, but it is certainly the most tedious movie I've seen in a very long time.
That's fair.
So
it's and probably the most tedious movie, certainly in the MCU pantheon.
So let's look at this as if we look at it in the greater MCU pantheon now. Do we really think this film is going to have an influence on the future of the MCU? You know,
well, the post-credit scenes, the mid and post-credit scenes might, simply because we got Star Fox and Pip the Troll and the Black Knight and the voice of Blade, all of which I'm way more excited about than ever seeing the Eternals again. What's interesting is that the characters of Star Fox and Pip the Troll in particular are characters who were very connected with Thanos. And the Thanos story is basically done. So I'm not really sure what they're going to do with that.
I think it's going to tie more into the multiverse issue than specifically his relationship with Thanos.
Yeah.
And of course, there's the rumor that Thanos might be back.
This is my excited face.
As there's another 10 years planned of Marvel at this point.
Oh, well, sure. You know, they're going to keep, milking that golden goose, he says, mixing his metaphors. But I'm way more excited about seeing the Black Knight, partly because Kit Harington was one of the best parts of the movie. And I've been excited about seeing Mahershala Ali play Blade since they announced that he was going to do it. So hearing his voice there, and I'm real curious as to how they're going to bring vampires into the MCU. But it's that's what got me excited far more than the actual movie itself. And I'm glad Fastos survived the whole movie. I would love to see more of Fastos and his family, more of Kingo and his Bollywood career, because that was fabulous. We could have just done a whole movie about him and just his various careers as different relations of himself. But that's about it.
Well, and I think that Hephaestus, to me, again, going back to that family character, has a potential of being one of those characters that should show up through much more of the MCU, especially as we go into the multiverse, because he's useful and he's a good, strong character. He has that energy to him and could have that potential utility to come in and say, yeah, we kind of tried to blow you up. Sorry about that. But yeah, and sorry about the whole nuclear weapons thing, but let's see what we can do now for the good of humanity. I think that there are a few characters coming out of this that potentially I'd like to see, but not a lot.
But
it just occurred to me that I want to see Fastos and Shuri get together.
That would be cool,
right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But they're almost setting Arishem up like Galactus. He's a destroyer of worlds. He's the Sun Eater. He's Galactus. I don't know that there's room for a lot of those in the MCU.
I think what they're going to be doing is with Arishem is some form of adaptation of the Celestials were actually judges of humanity. That was how they were set up. And there was a whole storyline that started in the Eternals and got finished in Thor about the Celestials basically bringing humanity to judgment. And I think that might be where they're going with this.
Well,
which
the
would be
thing
cool.
about your memories will help be the judge at the very, very end. Kind of seems to be going in that direction.
Yeah. But like the original comic, it may wind up happening in somebody else's movie just because no one wants to see another Eternals movie.
Well, Sony may have some time. But so in looking at other aspects to the film and the story, and maybe even going back to the original source material, do you think that there's anything, how many things here do you think are really worth mining to bring forward the MCU? And what are the other things that you think you really want to see? I mean, I know we just sort of touched on some of those pieces, but for example, we saw the head of Celestial as a part of Guardians. We know that that's what they were mining. This kind of ties back into that. To me, Eternals also just sort of feels like that midpoint of a film. If I looked at the entirety, if I looked at 20 years worth of Marvel, I could almost say, okay, well, the Eternals is this 10-minute midpoint in the middle of the great epic going on that sort of wants to tie things together. And maybe I'm giving it too much credit. But when we look at these, are there any other pieces to this that you wanted to see people dive into further, whether it was some of the historical factors of it or just some of the characters and how they wound up where they were at? Is there anything else you really would like to have seen and it maybe wound up on the cutting room floor because it was still 12 hours long and a 2.5-hour movie?
I would have liked to have seen, as we've kind of all said, more of the found family aspect being explored. Part of the problem I had with this film, though, it was kind of like, I haven't felt this way in a superhero film since Green Lantern, which is I just wasn't engaged and I wasn't invested. I mean, I didn't feel drawn in by the peril that we found out about for Earth. It just didn't pull me in. And I haven't really been able to figure out why. It's like with Green Lantern, there's this big bad out there and the Guardians are all worried about it. And I turned to my husband about an hour into the movie and said, do we have a reason to care about this? And he went, not yet. So I felt kind of the same way about Eternals. It's like, I didn't feel invested in them as a group because we saw them in snatches here and there and we didn't really see them develop and we didn't see much of them together. And then there was something about the menace to Earth that just didn't ring for me. I don't know what it was.
Yeah, all you're going to do is blow up the planet. Can you hurry up? Yeah.
Yeah, and it just the threat didn't feel all that real.
Yeah, maybe that's it.
And part of it was that most of the damage was done in the middle of nowhere in the Arctic, so it felt less consequential for that.
Jim, you kind of touched on this already, but I think if I'm thinking back on a movie, especially a Marvel movie, and not going, I want to see what happens next with these characters, but instead I'm way more interested in how all of this is going to affect other characters, that says a lot. Like the cameos both in that movie and like everyone saw Arisham's head, like what does Shang-Chi and Doctor Strange and everyone else think about it? And how are they going to deal with it? Because I'd be much more interested in how they're going to deal with it.
So is there anything else you guys want to touch on about the movie, about the arc?
I think I covered.
The whole arc could have been compressed into about 45 minutes.
I do want to give, and Nancy touched on this, but I want to mention it again. I want to give them credit for going for a much more interesting cast than what the original comics presented. Jack Kirby came of age in the 40s at a time when white guys were pretty much the default. And that was true for most of his career. And I don't want to hold him horribly responsible for the cultural norms that he grew up in, but I'm really glad that there was that the filmmakers took a serious look at characters who've been throughout all of human history. They wouldn't all be a bunch of white guys and one token black guy, because Phastos was dark skinned in the comics. The rest of them were all white dudes and like one or two white women, like Athena. That was it. Makari and Ajak were both male, and Pip and not Pip, the one who was a child.
Right.
Sprite, thank you. Sprite were all male in the comics originally. The three of them. And I like the fact that they went for more diverse casting, and it made it more convincing that they had walked throughout all of human history.
And little things, like I saw a clip of an interview with the actor who played Faustus, and where he, after he got hired, he was like, okay, how much weight do I have to lose? And they were like, no, you're fine. Like, just little things like that.
Well, and I think I referred to Sprite as Pixie, but that's neither here
You
nor
did.
there, because I think
Yeah,
I think that was my heckling throughout the entire movie.
That's
Is that-
okay.
Yeah,
Like
she was
halfway through this, I forgot who Ajax was for a second. I'm sorry.
And that, God, you know, there's so many. I mean, Gemma Chan and Salma Hayek, really in particular, and Lauren Ridloff and Don Lee all deserved so much better than what they got in this movie.
Well, and I think that was part of my pain for it, is we finally got some people we know are great talents, great actors, could bring a lot to some of these roles.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say didn't get the opportunity to. And some of that could be you were trying to pack way too much talent into one script, one movie, and trying to do it in a couple of hours, because probably they couldn't have afforded that budget for Disney Plus for some of those names. But I still would rather have seen the better story.
While we're mentioning Disney Plus, this is not really the Eternals, but I think the Hawkeye miniseries was a really good example of what you can do if you go for a miniseries instead of just a compacted, both that and the Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Use their time really well and really develop the characters, but they didn't have to jam it all into one sitting. And I think that really does make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and oh, go ahead, JL.
I'm just remembering, like, sitting in the theater and obviously being excited because it's a new MCU movie, and then seeing that text scroll across the screen, and I was like, oh my God, if you need to tell all of this to me before the movie even starts. And it's not like I have a problem with text scrolling across the screen, because it can be done well, i.e. Star Wars, but this was just like a lot of strange words, and like I was like, okay, what am I getting myself into? And I was right.
Yeah.
I did have that urge to want to buy a copy of Save the Cat and send it to the screenwriter's room, but I didn't do that either.
But you know what JL was just saying, it reminds me of what they tell us as writers is, if you get words that are too strange to the reader, they won't absorb them immediately and they won't be able to follow them. That you have to do that sparingly and not dump it all in front of people at one time. It's like when you read a murder mystery. I started one and I didn't finish it because in the first chapter they introduced 9 characters. And I had no hope of remembering who they all were when they started moving around and interacting in chapter 2. And I was kind of done. And I think the less anchored a story is in the world people recognize, the more pains you have to take to introduce the viewer or the reader to that world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like we didn't need, I mean, and not even just because like every other Marvel like movie was as ingrained in like the collective conscience, because like Guardians of the Galaxies, who are those guys? But like I didn't need a primer on them before the movie started.
Hell, Iron Man was really a B-list character before 2008. You know, the Marvel's A-list were taken up by other studios when they started this. But yeah, I mean, I one of the reasons why I was enthusiastic about Eternals was they already had Guardians of the Galaxy in the bank for me, and that gave me optimism that they could perform the same magic on the Eternals, and boy, didn't they.
So I am going to throw one more thing out there just to see what you guys think on this. Have we now set expectations of storytelling and everything so high with the MCU that what would have been an okay movie a number of years ago now just doesn't hit the standard? And we've seen, that battle between DC films and stylistically what we get there, the level of storytelling, and what we've gotten used to from the MCU. So, if we look at the difference between the two, is that one of the things that also has maybe hit against the Eternals as well? Or is it?
I think it's just the law of averages catching up to.
I wouldn't have liked this movie 15 years ago. I
Yeah.
mean, I would have still come away from it thinking it's a really gorgeous movie. The story.
Like,
I mean-
if I were to see a movie about a bunch of like found family immortals like saving the world, I'm just gonna go watch The Old Guard again.
Yeah. For that matter, I didn't like this movie when they did it in 2009 and called it Watchmen. It was also an overstuffed mess that didn't engage me enough in the characters and had too many flashbacks. Why that didn't work as a Watchmen movie were different reasons why that didn't work as an Eternals movie, and that's a different panel. But it has, the problems with the movie are basic structural problems that have nothing to do with what series it's in, and the fact that there was just too damn much story and too many damn characters for 2.5 hour or whatever movie. That ultimately is a problem that a basic structural problem that I don't think it could really get past.
Well, as we go in, and for those of us who have not yet seen, Doctor Strange into the Multiverse of Madness, what are you guys looking for next? Or looking forward to finish rinsing the Eternals out of your brain?
I am so looking forward to Ms. Marvel and the She-Hulk on Disney Plus. Both of those are wonderful characters whom I have adored for a very long time, and can't wait to see how they do them. And these are characters of more recent vintage. I'm glad they're finally moving into characters who were created. Well, She-Hulk was created in 1980, so not that recent, but at the very least, characters not created in the 60s.
I have yet to watch The Mandalorian. So I have like 2 seasons accumulated that when I get some deadlines behind me, I can watch. And I'm really looking forward to Dark Crisis in the comic book, because the legacy heroes who were, sort of the age of the kids I grew up with as I was growing up are stepping to the fore after a couple of decades of being seen as detrimental to the other characters. And I want to see the Multiverse of Madness in the theater. And
the good news is I think they are going to do a crossover between Grogu and Baby Groot for the holidays. JL.
Yeah, I until I stop popping positive, I obviously am not going to go see Doctor Strange in the theaters, and so I'm hesitant to make any predictions without having that full context, because I have the feeling that that's going to hit so many awesome notes for me. So
I have seen it, and I think it will.
Oh, there's one other thing. There's one other thing I thought about that last year. I think it was last year. Patty Jenkins released a short video on social media that she was going to make. I think it's Rogue Squadron. She's going to make, I think it's a series about X-Wing pilots. Mm-hmm. And it's been postponed. And I was really looking forward to Wonder Woman 1984, and I was hugely disappointed. So I'm going to give Patty another chance, and I'm really looking forward to these X-Wing pilots. And Patty, don't let me down. Just wanted to add that while we're talking about that.
I mean, if we're going to talk about Star Wars, I'm counting down until Kenobi comes out. So,
well, I think we've beaten the Eternals up better than the Celestials did. So, before we get out of here, let's make sure everybody knows where to find you guys. So, Keith,
search for Keith R.A. DeCandido online, and I am the only one who will turn up. You can find me at DeCandido.net, which is a terrible website, but it links conveniently to all the various places you can cyberstalk me. I maintain a blog on WordPress. I'm fairly active on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I write for Tor.com. You can find my books. Again, search for my name, and you will find my books on whatever your online book dealer of choice is. I've got lots of stuff coming out this year, last year, next year. I keep writing things because they keep paying me for it, and if they stop paying me for it, well, I'll probably still write things anyway. So yeah. It's a compulsion.
JL?
You can find me at jlgribble.com, which also links to all the places that I hang out on social media. And that is also the home of my very prolific book review blog. And I'm currently working on the finale to my urban fantasy series. The world has not been nice to me in that regard, but I promise that I'm working on it.
Nancy?
You can find information about me at nancynorthcott.com. I have a Facebook page that I rarely do anything with, so you're probably wasting your time to look for me there. But I spend more time on Twitter than is probably good for me, and I'm at Nancy Northcott on Twitter. I'm also, if you look at the ConTinual Comics layer, I'm on every panel on the ConTinual page on YouTube. That part of Facebook I am on because Jim does the work for that.
And I have been the host for this one that's been not the comics layer. I'm Jim Nettles. You can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentials.net, authoressentialsworkshops.com, the speculative-fiction-academy.com, and of course, here at ConTinual. And hope you guys have had an evening of listening to us bemoan a favored franchise.
Someone had to do it.
Yeah.
Somebody else. We had to join the party.